podcast from Peach 2020, hosted by Peter Martin.
Hello, I'm Peter Martin, founder of Peach 2020, the international community for senior executives, entrepreneurs and influencers from across the hospitality sector. Welcome to the latest in our series of Top Table podcasts. Today we are broadcasting from the studio at Brewdog Waterloo, Brewdog's newly opened location here in London, which has also just won the Peach Best Destination Award for 2022. So a big thank you to the Brewdog team for looking after us today. Now, this series of podcasts will see me in conversation with some of the real movers and shakers in the out-of-home food and drink business, picking up on the issues they are facing and that are shaping the future of our industry. My guest today is Kim Teo, a passionate entrepreneur who is CEO and co-founder of Mr. Yum, a young tech company that's making waves around the hospitality sector from Australia to the UK to the US. She says her excitement, drive and enthusiasm come from the opportunity to work on big ideas with amazing people. But before I ask her about those ideas and the people currently grabbing her attention, let me say, welcome to Top Table, Kim Teo.
Thank you so much for having me. How good's doing a podcast in person?
It's great. It really is good. It's certainly a move away from doing everything over Zoom.
100%.
But it makes the point about technology being such an important part of our daily lives now. And I suppose the first question before we start talking about you, your background and Mr. Yum is fundamentally, does the hospitality market need more technology?
I don't think it needs more and more technology. I think it just needs its technology to work better together, seamlessly with other pieces of technology, but also with the hospitality of hospitality, which is the service elements of hospitality. So yeah, I don't think it's necessarily stacking tech on top of each other. I think it's finding a way for it to all connect.
Do you have a vision for what sort of hospitality going forward will look like in terms of integrating hospitality, integrating technology into that hospitality experience, bearing in mind we do live in a digital age, whether we like it or not?
Yeah, guests experience the brand via technology. They experience the brand on their phones from home. They experience the brand with their friends through digital mediums, on social, etc. So I think technology is all around us, whether we like it or not. That's the age that we live in today. And I think hospitality brands are finding really interesting and clever ways to leverage the right mediums and meet their customers where their customers want to be met, and also make sure that the service elements of hospitality are still delightful in the venue.
So it's all about getting the balance right. So let's turn to Mr. Yum and the company, and we'll talk a bit more about you as well, so we get a feel for how you've got into this industry. So what is it about Mr. Yum? What is it offering that makes it different, and what is the need it's filling?
Yeah, sure. We're a platform that we build products that help hospitality serve their guests as well as connect with their guests via CRM, email marketing, SMS marketing, etc., and reward components. So how do you make sure that your guests come back? What can you do for them that make sure that they're incentivized to get back? So there's like a reward component as well, and trying to close the loop around that guest experience. There's different products that serve that, fill the need across different sections of what we do. We're trying to, as much as possible, have a really frictionless and simple all-in-one solution that's guest-facing and customer-facing.
So where does Mr. Yum come in on that customer journey? So if I'm a customer going into a bar or restaurant, when would I first encounter Mr. Yum as part of that?
Hopefully you encounter it because a host, someone at the first person that you meet at the venue has a way to greet you. So I think the most important thing that we talk about is it's not about shoving the technology in front of someone's hands or eyes. It's about greeting them and making sure they sit and making sure they understand that the way that you view the menu, the way that you visualize the menu, hopefully the way that you personalize the menu that's tailored to that individual is via a web-based menu, and then you can order and you can pay. But also not just order and pay, but you can actually spend more time with the service and take the opportunity to interact with them because they're not running around trying to take orders or trying to put them into POS systems.
I mean, let's talk about that because I think that is probably the biggest criticism of as it were, might be called seasoned hospitality operators who are perhaps a bit sceptical about technology coming into their bars and restaurants. It is about losing that the element of hospitality, that face-to-face engagement. So how do you I mean, you sort of touched on it, but, is it about giving the staff more time? I mean, how do you see customers using your technology?
The best adopters of the technology, they all do it by building the technology into the steps of sequence of service. So it's not the first thing that you bring out and it's not the last thing that happens because the first and the last touch points still need to remain human. So you don't, as soon as you walk in, have like a poster that says, scan the QR code and see the menu, go sit yourself down and see you later. Like that's not the interaction that hospitality working through. Like that's not the right way to do it. The way to do it is to introduce it as a second point in the sequence of service. First, you've got to greet someone. You've got to say hello. You've got to hopefully know their name because the technology tells you who they are and know that they have been there before or they're with someone new maybe or they're a VIP to your venue. And then introduce them to the technology and let the technology do some of the administrative work that your staff now have a bit of free time to be able to actually interact with guests. I think where restaurants or pubs or bars find it a little bit difficult is if they have a perception that if the staff aren't taking orders, they then don't have a reason to talk to the guests. They feel like the order taking is like the main interaction between the guest and the staff. And that's one out of like 7 or 8 typical steps of sequence, which includes greeting them at the start, bringing their food over, even bringing the water and the cutlery over, making sure and checking back once they've had their food and drinks, checking back to make sure that things are going well. These are things that technology can help you with, but they don't traditionally do with the same level of human touch that a human can do. So I think it's not about, there is a bit of skepticism where maybe they feel, I think it's a lot of like post-COVID trauma around almost being like forced. Yeah. It's like being like having had your hand forced to use a piece of technology that when a lot of venues first implemented it, because of the restrictions around COVID, they actually couldn't get very close. Yeah. Right. So like the first time it came into a lot of venues was a time when you weren't allowed to like be in proximity of your guests. And so there's an impression that the sequence of service with an in-venue ordering experience is one of distance, but it's not one of distance anymore where brands have implemented it well. Yeah. And I think that the brands that are implementing it well realize that if they have a touch point steps, it's 2 or 3 of the touch points, including the ordering and the payment that you don't have to
That's quite interesting because in a sense what you're saying is that if people understand what technology can do, they can actually have even more human interaction, but need to perhaps adapt to the advantages technology brings. So if you're doing it the same old way, you may have problems, but if you adapt, you can have a better experience for the consumer. Because I mean, all the research shows that actually consumers will tell you, the majority, that actually technology has the ability to enhance their experience. All the research tells you that, but it's a matter of how I think operators do that. Going back to your experience, I mean, how did you get into the tech world and 2 into the hospitality tech world?
The tech world, I think it was largely probably a like age and demographic. I'm 35 this year, and I grew up in my teenage years starting to have computers and use computers, and then probably hit about 17, 18 and got introduced to mobile phones at the time. So I think always wanting to, I always knew from a very young age, I was lucky to grow up in a family that had small businesses, that I wanted to do something of my own and wanted to create stuff. And I think my generation was just, if you're going to create something, you're going to do it by technology. So I don't think I was like different to anyone else in my generation. I just think it was part of our
But of course,
growing
that wasn't in UK. You grew up in Singapore and then moved to Australia.
Yeah, I spent a lot of my younger years in Singapore and then moved to Melbourne, pretty young as well.
But in terms of, that's where you went to university and that's where you first started your business career in Australia. I mean, and in big corporations, like you work for JP Morgan, you work for...
Don't remind me.
Well, okay, well, tell me about that. I mean,
joking.
how has that influenced you for better or worse then?
JP Morgan has like such a reputation and high intensity work. You know, I worked on the trading floor for the first 11 months of my career, and it was a very male dominated environment, but also be pretty ego driven and pretty loud and boisterous. And it did feel like the loudest voice in the room often won the contest. The movies are relatively real and a lot of the shows around that stuff is true. I took away from that probably more than anything how to level with people of different age, demographic, experiences, and how to interact with someone who has lots of different, almost has so much life experience as well as a junior that's just starting. And then I went into consulting for a little bit and I worked at a pretty small company that was about 35 people when I first started and 200-ish people when I left. And they had a real family culture. And I think a lot of the culture of Mr. Yum today, I subconsciously probably took from the consulting firm that grew from about 30 to 200 and did that really elegantly.
But you've done been involved in other small entrepreneurial startups as well.
Yeah, a couple of failed startups before Mr. Yum.
Never bad experience, so you won't make the same mistakes.
Absolutely not. I met Kerry and Adrian, my two co-founders, doing my first startup. And even though it didn't succeed, we are still working together today, 8-9 years later. And networks and experiences and building experiences with each other is so much part of that journey.
Tell us about Mr. Yum, how that came about. I mean, it's only just sort of 4 years old, isn't it, as an enterprise? And already you're here in UK, you've got obviously in Texas. So, you know, one thing you don't lack is ambition. But, you know, wind back to that launch and that idea. I mean, as you said, you know, you've grown up with technology. Why did you go for that bit of technology?
Such a silly idea when it was first thought of, which was, I think what we noticed was the contradiction between what was happening in the restaurants and the behavior of consumers outside of the restaurant, which was people are visual and they want to see what the menu looks like. And so you'd walk into a restaurant and you'd get a menu and you watch groups of young folks and they would get Instagram out and they're like looking at the menu and looking at Instagram and trying to piece together the puzzle of a menu, which is what do I want to eat based on what does the food look like? And there's heaps of research. I think 1 in 8 people look at the menu before they go into a restaurant, and a portion of that, I'm sure, would be looking at the menu via Instagram and social, which is a visual way to see a menu. So the first idea was so silly. It was like, can we put a QR code on a physical menu, like a PDF printed menu, and it would say, see the photos of all the dishes, and you'd scan the QR code and you just get exactly the same menu, but like everything's brought to life through visuals. And we then met hospitality operators through doing that said the menu's like cute and it has some functionality, but no one's really going to pay for a photo menu. And it doesn't really, it adds value to the guest, but it doesn't really change our bottom line, I guess you would say. And it's not, you know, super top of mind, number 1, 2, and 3 things I'm thinking about. And a few operators sat us down and said, if you can be the menu, can you then, you know, take the orders and then can you take the payment? And Mr. Yum was entirely born out of listening to some of our earliest customers. We knew that maybe we could do payments at some point to like monetize the business. But Australia is one of the most consumer forward like technology countries in the world, and Facebook and Instagram, et cetera, they test a lot of their new concepts in Australia to see if the adoption is good. It's very like reflective of what the adoption will be like in America. If the American audience are going to like it, for example, Australia is a very close experiment ground. And, prior to, like, it's got the highest Apple Pay adoption in the world and did 5 years ago, even though we didn't invent Apple Pay. Like, Apple Pay was invented in America and it's less accepted in America than it is in Australia. And we were walking around without any cards. Like, I don't have any cards on me today. That was happening 5 years ago. So, yeah, I think the consumer adoption of digital wallets, Apple Pay, making payment really easy, as well as adoption of technology and hospitality is high there.
So in a sense, UK operators do themselves a favour by going to find out what's happening in Australia.
I get that all the time. I think the UK probably feel like there's a lot of Australian companies that come here. you probably feel like, why are all the Aussie companies bringing their pieces of technology to the UK? The cultures are quite similar. We all really like pubs. We drink a lot. Like, there's a lot of similarities in the way that people interact and behave. But I also think that Australia is a really easy place to incubate an idea, get it off the ground, and then get the funding to then take it overseas, because Australians love the underdog. Whereas I think in the UK, there's more like, what do we know? What do we trust? What can we rely on? What's been around for many, many years that's proven technology. Right. I'm going to put that in my restaurant. I'm going to put that in my pub, as opposed to something new. In Australia, people love the new stuff. They love the underdog. They love the innovators, and they're more willing to try.
Yeah, let's pick up on that point about, how have you been received in UK? I mean, you said perhaps we are not as open as Australians are, but I mean, how in the last year really you've been over here. So how's that developed, and how's your thinking about the UK market changed, if at all?
I'd love to hear your opinion on us at some point, but I think the UK market have been very kind to us. I think there's a very high standard around, you got to do what you're going to say, and you have to do what you say you're going to do. And you're going to have to do that consistently. So you've got to deliver on your promises. You can't sell something that you don't have. You have to be open and honest and transparent and actually do the thing you're going to say. And if you do that consistently, the word spreads relatively quickly and the reputation builds fast from there. So I think the UK market, of course, when we first entered, there was skepticism about who we are, who we were, and whether we were going to deliver or not. Like, that's number one question. Like, who are these guys? Are they going to deliver what they say they can do? And if you do that for one provider at one venue, and you do that for another partner, you do it for another partner, and other technology partners as well, like other partners in the ecosystem, whether that be POS or Wi-Fi solutions or feedback systems. If you continue to live up to your promises, I think your reputation can build very quickly in this market.
As a result of that, the sort of feedback you've got, the reaction you've got from the UK market, have you sort of changed the way you're operating, and has your offer changed?
Our offer hasn't changed a whole lot. I think we probably sell it differently. So there's a bigger desire for social proof and credibility.
Yeah, right.
So it's not necessarily about what does the product do. It's about who else is using your product and what do they say about it? Because I don't want to hear what you've got to say, because you're obviously going to do a good job at selling your product and telling me, but who else is using your product, and what do the operators say, and what is it doing for their business, and how is it lifting their sales, and how is it improving their margins? Yeah. So I think in Australia, it's less of that. Here, it's a lot of that. Yeah. In the US, it's very competitive, right? Like, that's a market where probably hospitality businesses are sold to more than anywhere else in the world. Like, it's just innovation galore. And they're probably a little bit like, this is what I want, and can you deliver what I want? They're like problem statement first.
Right.
As opposed to what are other people doing? It's like, no, this is the way, this is what I want. Can you do what I want? The product, what I want to do. So yeah, very culturally nuanced and different. Yeah. but the world wouldn't be fun without it.
That is true. But I suppose one of the things is about, is this saving me money? Is this saving me time? I mean, are you cutting through that? Because that is very much a UK approach to life, particularly at the moment, because costs are rising, and if people are going to invest in technology, half the business operators say they are, but nonetheless, it's a tough decision to make that sort of layout.
We actually implemented Miss Yum at the Brewdog location in Brisbane, which is that was their first Australian location, and we put it in about maybe 12 weeks ago. And James Brown, who's the MD of hospitality, sent me a kind of a chart that he'd been showing to his board, which was the weeks at the bottom and 1 through to like 36. And Mr. Yum was implemented in week 22. And each bar is like a year-on-year movement. So how did you do week 1 compared to last year, week 1, week 2 compared to the last year, week 2? And since implementing Mr. Yum, they've had on average like 25% increase in sales year on year. And nothing else, according to him, has changed in that business. And prior to that, they were pretty flat. Like some weeks were up and some weeks were down and some weeks were at zero change from the year before. And he attributes that to the style of location. It's a very big, very like similar to Waterloo, right? Like massive space. The bar is a distance away from your table. You want to sit down with your friends and interact with them and not be going up to the bar and getting orders. So they get 50% of their orders going through the product and a overall 25% increase in top line sales. You have to implement it well for it to work.
Yeah, that is the biggest objection to tech, actually. Things don't integrate and aren't implemented as well as people expect.
I think there's a lot of work, and I spend at least 15 to 20% of my week with external partners, essentially, whether that be POS partners, any technology company in the stack, because there is a lot of work for us to do in not just better integrations and better APIs, but better support for each other. So if something's not working in the integration, or if something isn't 100% between a system that we've integrated and us, the ability for us to get on a phone call and do that really, really quickly and almost treat each other like our teams rather than external third parties, I think there's a little bit of a way to go.
Let's talk about integration in that broader sense. I mean, do you think at board level hospitality companies, and let's face it, you are dealing with corporates mainly because that's the way of the world, because they can afford in that more general sense to work with companies like you. Do you sense that senior directors actually really grasp the capabilities of technology? One of the things we see is that perhaps bosses want things to happen, they want things to talk to each other, but actually haven't got their tech stack right. So the basic structure's not there. I mean, are you having those sort of conversations? It seems to me that the industry is going through some sort of real growing pains at the moment, and there are some tough decisions that people are possibly, putting off when they should be taking them now.
I couldn't agree. Or I was actually reflecting on the way here at a conversation that I had with someone at the Peach 2020 awards night, which was a level of almost like having given up around technology was like the sentiment that I was getting from this super well-respected industry folk. And it almost felt like they'd been trying for years to innovate and to use new pieces of interesting technology, whether that be guest-facing or operational. And because the systems aren't talking to each other or have told them things that haven't gone the way that they've accepted. It almost felt like they'd given up, and it was heartbreaking.
And you can't afford to give up, really, because if you're not going forward, you're sort of going backwards.
So what does an operator do about that? They call this provider. They say, "Well, can you work with them?" They call the other one, "Can you work with them?" And if not, the two partners are saying yes and eagerly saying yes. Like, we've got such a huge mountain to climb if the partners in the industry, if the tech partners in the industry don't want to work hand in hand with each other and figure out what we can do better outside of what the operators are telling us. I think that's actually, it's much more real in the UK compared to in the US or in ANZ. This challenge of almost feeling like they've tried a lot of things and given up.
Yeah, is that because that's not part of their experience, because that's not where they come from? I mean, it was interesting at Peach 2020, Jason Cotter of Ollie & Steam was saying that he's probably talking more about marketing, but it's with a tech base. What he has to do is, one, to bring outside experts in, because that's the way to do it, you know. And then I was talking to another senior exec from a bigger company as well, saying, yeah, we brought a lot of experts in, but that's causing tension because these guys get paid a lot more than some of the operations people. So we've got, I mean, we talk about growing pains. This is a lot of tensions, particularly when costs are tight.
And the cost of change is expensive.
Yes, indeed.
It's not just the cost of the hardware, it's the cost of re-educating staff at hundreds of locations. It's the cost of things that will inevitably go wrong when you try and change systems. So the cost of change is high. I couldn't agree more. I think there's a lot of impending questions, I think, that will be answered or change that will be made in 2020.
Because one level we're talking about is operational efficiencies and cost savings as well. But the other thing is about the data you can get as well, because, you know, people are getting a lot of data, particularly on consumers and increasingly on their teams as well. But often I find that data is incomplete because systems aren't talking, they're not correlating that data. Is that part of the, as it were, the broad sales pitch back to the industry that why they should embrace tech more is actually there is a real pot of gold about understanding your customers, your staff, when you really start working on bringing all that data together?
Yeah, the aggregation of data it's a new adventure, because 2 years ago people weren't collecting much data in the first place. So if you weren't collecting much data in the first place a few years ago, then you don't really think about how you're going to use that data, right? Yeah. So it's like, now that I've got all this data, what am I going to do with it? Well, how do I make it? How do I use it? How do I make it better? There's going to be, not in the distant future, a world where you're on a high street of restaurants and you'll all kind of have access to similar consumers who live in and around that area. So if someone lives in your neighborhood, they've probably gone to a whole bunch of restaurants in the neighborhood, and maybe a lot of those restaurants are going to have those, consumer details, right? So how do you make yourself the more attractive place to go to on a Wednesday night or a Thursday night or a Friday? You've got to offer them something that's interesting to them and unique and tell them what's going on in your restaurant. And I met a business actually yesterday who has 16 events on in the next 4 weeks. And he's like, I need to find out who likes, who's into this football team and who's into that, and segment my customers to make sure that I'm sending them the right events to the right people. And he's doing that as a way to keep his business interesting, to get people to come back. And that stuff works. It does work. And you can automate it. Like, you can actually get technology to do that work for you. So no, you're not sitting there every single day trying to figure out what to say about each individual event or what to say to each individual group of customers. You can actually automate stuff like that.
Which brings it all back in terms of the value of tech and data back to that customer experience, because that's the payoff at the end of the day, particularly at the moment. How do you get people coming back, particularly in tough times, whether it's here in the UK, in the States or Australia? They're the key things. But looking forward, Kim, what's catching your eye? What next for you? Because you're restless, you're an entrepreneur. I mean, you're going into new markets. So what next for you guys?
We've got ambitions to take on these 3 markets and focus on them. We're not largely trying to go anywhere else. Personally, within the UK specifically, we've almost got we feel like we've got to change the impression of technology in the industry. Yeah. Like, we feel like we're working with other technology partners to level up and to make ourselves way more easy to work with and make ourselves way more attractive to work with, way more fun to work with. Not like oh, I've got to call them. That sucks. Like, oh, I want to call them because they're going to be all over it and they're going to help me do something and they're going to tell me something new. So I think we've got, to be fair, 2 to 3 years worth of work in this market to change the almost like the reputation of technology and to show the operators that you can actually reduce cost by putting the high GP products that you want to sell at the top of your menu. Like there's so much stuff that a dynamic digital menu can do to change your product sales mix and to make sure you sell the right products and you're not selling the products that cost a lot of energy, or you're selling the products that are super easy, that are low energy costs, for example, right? There's so much stuff you can do, but we're almost feeling like we need to invest a lot of time and love into like making getting that love back into technology. Yeah.
Because you can see how for some people that can be quite scary. Other people that's really exciting about having all that data at your fingertips and using it to give it great experiences. Because I think, as we come to an end of this fascinating chat, I think one thing is clear, that the digital world isn't going away and it's sort of baked into the next generation. I'll tell you an anecdote which my wife and I were picking up our granddaughter from nursery a few weeks ago, and we said, so what do you have for lunch, Connie? And she said, oh, I really can't remember. I'll look on the app. Even her nursery's got an app which she or a mother can actually access via her iPad. So, it's there. There is no going away from it. So, Kim, look, thanks for your time today. Thanks for joining me in this brand spanking new studio here, here at Brewdog Waterloo. Kim, thanks for your time.
Thank you.
The Peach Podcast is always free to listen to. To find us, search Peach 2020, the top table on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, or in any app that supports podcasts. All of our podcasts will be updated to our YouTube channel. Now, don't forget to like, rate, and subscribe to make sure you don't miss our future episodes. Goodbye.
Podcast from Peach 2020, hosted by Peter Martin.